All right, so I'm trying something new. We're gonna try Screencast-O-Matic. It's actually not new. I've used it prior to this, but I can get 15 minutes of recording. So hopefully we will go on photochemical smog, and I won't have to be going too crazy on it. So after reading this module, you should be able to explain, and after listening to these notes, you should be able to explain how photochemical smog forms and why it's still a problem in the United States, and then describe how acid deposition forms and why it's actually improved in the United States, and is becoming worse in other places in the world. So let's see if I can try to change the shape a little bit there so don't get overlapped. Okay. So the formation of photochemical smog is actually really complex. We don't understand all of it. We know what the ingredients are, and we know kind of the basic, what needs to happen in order for this to be catalyzed. A number of pollutants are involved in it. It seems to be that it's just kind of like the perfect storm. Like all those mix has to be there. Okay, so what normally happens with the production of ozone is that when there are no VOCs, ozone will form just as a natural process, and it'll form during daylight hours because the presence of UV energizes that. The UV is the source of energy. But after sunset, the ozone will break back down, and that's a good thing because ozone is toxic for us. We don't want it nearby. We don't want it at the level that we're breathing. But when VOCs are present, ozone will form during the day, and then the VOCs will combine with those nitrogen oxides, and it'll form photochemical oxidants, which will actually, they will reduce the amount of ozone that will break down later and contribute to prolonged periods of photochemical smog. So we get, because of this addition of VOCs, then the photochemical smog will stick around. Sometimes for really long periods of time. Sometimes it doesn't break down, it just has to be rained away. Okay? One of the contributing factors to the presence of smog in cities, especially in certain cities, is this concept of the thermal inversion. I know that there's part of the video that you watched earlier that talks about thermal inversions. And then I'm looking for, there's a section in your book on thermal inversions in the Princeton Review. So it starts on, I think, page 255. Thermal inversions is actually discussed in the section called thermal pollution. And so sometimes we refer to urban areas as as heat islands because the amount of pavement that is there and the lack of vegetation, the increased absorption of light, so that reduced albedo, creates an area, a pretty large area, that has a really high amount of heat. So we refer to these urban areas as heat islands. This heat has an effect on that smog. There's two ways that we, there's two things that we're doing in cities to kind of offset this. A lot of times you're going to see the tops of buildings painted white, and then we're trying to green up our cities and plant more trees and do living walls or gardens on the tops of big buildings to mitigate some of the issues that are happening, to create this hazard of the thermal inversion. So a thermal inversion basically is a situation in which there's a relatively warm layer of air at mid-altitude, and it's going to hold a little warm blanket. It holds down some cold, dense air below it. The inversion layer, the layer of warm air that traps emissions, is the layer of the thermal inversion that's actually the issue. Warm inversion layer traps emissions. They accumulate below it, and then the thermal inversions that create pollution events are particularly common in cities where there's a high concentration of vehicle exhaust, where the air is relatively warm, and where it's relatively still, where we don't have super high winds. So the entire California Valley. Oh, it's an issue for us. All right, so you can see in this illustration, Normal conditions would mean that, like, as you move up into thinner and thinner areas, as you get away from the source of this re-radiating heat, so like the sun comes down, it's absorbed and it re-radiates out from the ground and from the city center, and then the further you get away from a heat source, the cooler you get, right? But in a thermal inversion, when you begin to move up, then there's like this layer of air that's warm. Once it moves through, then you get another cooler layer. But it's this warm layer here that sits and heavy, and it doesn't allow particles to keep moving up, and so you get trapped emissions and trapped pollution. All right, so I had to take a little break from all the talking, so I'm jumping back in after a pause in the session. So I had just been discussing the phenomenon that we refer to as thermal inversions. And so going forward, what this does is it creates a cloud, basically, of pollution above cities, right? And then you get this phenomenon. I'm going to show the picture first. This phenomenon happens. And so here you have these primary pollutants, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides. And here is like illustration of there's like wind and a mixing of these components with O2 oxygen. And that creates sulfuric acid. And then when you get these salts, right, that mix with water and they condense around particles that are in the air, or these might be the particles where the water is being brought in and it's condensing and forming a cloud, but it's acid that's being created and not just pure water. And this acid deposition forms, it moves, travels, and then when those clouds get heavy enough, then they rain down. Acid deposition occurs when nitrogen oxide and sulfur oxides are released in the atmosphere. They combine with oxygen and water. They form the secondary pollutants of nitric acid and sulfuric acid. And then secondary pollutants break down into nitrates and sulfates. Those are toxic. And hydrogen ions, that is what really causes acid deposition. So acid deposition, it has been reduced in the United States because we don't burn as much coal. So we have, as a result of this lower sulfur dioxide emissions, then we don't have as much. We still have a lot of nitrogen oxide emissions, but as you saw in the chart earlier, that those have decreased as well because of the regulations that the EPA has implemented on cars, on vehicles and transportation, in terms of what is tolerated on the roads. Okay, so we've increased. It's been engineering differences and changes in the efficiency of vehicles, and the way in which they're burning is cleaner, and so it has gotten better. All right. Okay. Some of the effects of acid rain: it lowers pHs in lake water, so it makes it more acidic. Decreases species diversity for aquatic organisms because of that. So there's like there's like a range of tolerance for organisms, and when you drop below a particular pH, it's more acidic, then you have like protective outer barriers, especially like in oceanic organisms, really small oceanic organisms that use calcium on the exoskeleton, and it dissolves calcium. So this is an issue for really small aquatic organisms. Mobilizing metals are also found in soils, and they can be released into surface waters because those metals they're in what's referred to as an aggregate. So they've been bonded, basically, held in place with some kind of component in the soil, and when the acid rain is infiltration happens through the soil, that acidic solution can actually break some of those bonds, and it will release those metals that are found in the soil, and they can be toxic, and they'll move into surface waters, or they can move into groundwater, and then like things that just damage to statues, monuments, buildings, things that we see kind of in front of us. All right, we made it through that module. And not doing too bad. 10 minutes on that one. It's better than getting interrupted for another 5-minute session. Alrighty, I'm going to stop here.